And so I'd like to invite Matthew Behrens to come from the Stop Torture in Canada, a tireless human rights activist who will explain Canada's involvement in torture.
The Lion has one very clear message for Prime Minister Harper and for Foreign Affairs Minister Lawrence Cannon, and that is show some courage. Stand up for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Stand up for a Canadian citizen's right to come home. We're here today because, as Jim said, it's not only Mr. Abdelrazik who has been targeted for torture. We have a long list of names. Mr. Benamar Banata, our first post-9/11 rendition to torture, September the 12th, 2001, spent 5 years in the United States, indefinitely detained, tortured. He's back in Canada and for the past 2 years has sought a public inquiry and received nothing. No justice. We know the case of Meher Awar, a year in what he called a grave-like cell in Syria. He came back to Canada. 1/3 of his inquiry was held in public, and that was enough for the Canadian government and especially CSIS and the RCMP to say we will never again have such a public inquiry. And so it was when Abdullah al-Malki, Ahmed al-Mahdi and Muyad Nuruddin, all Canadian citizens, were targeted for torture by the Canadian government. They came back. Their inquiry was held in complete and utter secrecy. And so we see a pattern of diminishing results here. When Canadians are targeted for torture, they come back seeking justice. And we think that the Canadian government strategy here is not just a secret inquiry in which the people who are tortured cannot attend. The pattern is, we're not even going to let you come back to Canada's intelligence agencies to have you detained, interrogated, and tortured. And if you read this morning's Globe and Mail, you will see that in 2003, CSIS was secretly interrogating Mr. Abdelrazik in the Sudan 6 full years ago. You can see why CSIS, even though they have cleared him, might not want him to be back here in Canada as well. Today in Ottawa, Abdullah al-Malki, one of those Canadians who was targeted for torture, will be reading a statement, and he wants to point out that we were told when we were held overseas there was nothing Canada could do, that it had to respect the procedures of the detaining country. And yet when that other country determined it had been duped into believing the Canadian detainee was a threat, when that other country decided to release the innocent Canadian, our government officials tried hard not to provide any assistance. In Mr. al-Mahdi's case, it denied him travel documents for many months. In Mr. al-Malki's case, he was kicked out of the Canadian embassy after a Syrian court acquitted him of all charges. He asks, how can we believe that the Canadian government's policies have changed when the case of Mr. Abdelrazik is screaming in our faces? How would any Canadian official feel if he or she was taken away from his or her children? How can they sleep at night when they are depriving other Canadian children of their father? It pains Mr. al-Malki that nothing seems to have been learned from the terrible treatment he received at the hands of Canadian officials. He had hoped that the government would have learned not to hide the truth, not to keep its victims in exile. It looks like the Canadian government does not want its citizens to come home. Is it for fear that they will show again how the system is broken and that there will be further examples of this pattern? Isn't Mr. Abdelrazik a living testimony of the government policies that have not been reformed? When are we going to have one measuring stick for all Canadians? When will we treat all Canadians with justice, dignity, and respect? When will we bring Mr. Abdelrazik home from Sudan to his children? That is Mr. Abdullah al-Malki, who will be speaking shortly in Ottawa.
We're going to be hearing from some of 225 Canadians who risked 10 years in jail by donating to a fund for a plane ticket to bring Abousfian Abdelrazik home. Since our government won't do it, then some citizens have said, then we will do it. And some of these people are here. They have a letter in front of them, and we're going to be hearing briefly, in a few moments, a brief statement from them. And I was, for 4 months, a Canadian citizen in trouble abroad. I was a hostage in Iraq. And I didn't know this at the time, but when I was released, I discovered that the Prime Minister at the time, Paul Martin, said, we are doing everything we possibly can. And to my astonishment and amazement, they did. They sent a team to Baghdad that worked around the clock. There was a team in Ottawa working. There was my the Department of Foreign Affairs and the RCMP were in constant contact with my family. We were rescued or released in a military operation, and the Canadian government sent a Hercules airplane to fly Harmeet and I home, with a Canadian diplomat escorting us because our passports had been stolen from us. And I was so moved and so grateful that my government would reach to that length to help me when I was in trouble. Abousfian Abdelrazik is a Canadian citizen just like me, just like pretty much all of us here today. And he's with us as citizens, and the most basic right that we have is the right to come home. Without that, we have nothing. So I'm glad that you're here, and all of us together, we are calling on our government to honor its obligations, to allow one of our citizens to come home. And he's going to explain why he's doing that.
There are many different ways to protest this particular issue. This is just one of them. This hunger strike will begin today and then go on till Thursday when the court hearing takes place. The main reason, as everyone here is well aware of, is to bring Mr. Abdelrazik home. So I call on the Canadian government, no, I'll change that. I demand that the Canadian government bring Mr. Abdelrazik home. And I call on Canadians all across Canada to do the same. They should be outraged at this point, and we should be all calling on Mr. Harper to bring Mr. Abdelrazik home. That's what we should be calling.
I would like to call upon the former mayor of Toronto, the person who has spoken out in the past for human rights in Canada, to speak about why he's here today.
My name is John Sewell. On the weekend, I happened to be in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I had to make a speech at an institute on Saturday morning. On Saturday afternoon, I attended a reception where we were honoring some graduates of this institute. One of the people who was also at the reception, and like me making a few remarks at it, was Bob Nicholson, the Minister of Justice for Canada. The Globe and Mail had a very strong editorial on Friday, I think it was Friday, suggesting that in fact he, as the Attorney General, had a duty to give the government the bad news that it had to enforce the law. And in fact he should be bringing Mr. Abdelrazik home, because that's what the law says should be the case. So I thought, what a terrific opportunity. So I said, Mr. Nicholson, nice to meet you. This is before the ceremony. How are you doing? Fine, I'm John Swoop, right? I said, you know, I'm a subscriber to Mr. Abdelrazik. And he said, what do you mean a subscriber? Well, I said, I've subscribed to the ticket to bring him home. I said, he's a Canadian citizen, and he has a right like me and like you to be brought home. Oh, said Mr. Nicholson, did you know that he was on the UN terrorist list? I said, yes, I know that. But that list says that he, in fact, has a right to return home. That's what the UN terrorist list actually says. Thank you very much, he said, and he walked away from me immediately. So I thought, this is a real pity. We're talking person to person, and in fact, he has no good reason as to what he's doing. There's nothing worse in our society than for an individual to be under a false suspicion. For someone to think of that individual that they've done something wrong. This is putting people under false suspicion is something we often do to people who we think are different than us, the so-called majority. We often do it to people who are of different color or different language. We clearly have done it to Mr. Abdelrazik. In fact, it seems, and just from the list of people, it seems to be part and parcel of the terrorist agenda that we have in Canada, that we put those who we think are different under false suspicion. We clearly do it to landed immigrants. Worse, as we've now found out, we do it to citizens. And my feeling is this is entirely unacceptable behavior by our